Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's May 14, 2023, and today we are speaking with Gabrielle Paluk, author of a new book just published by Roman and Littlefield, titled The Opium Queen, The Untold Story of the Rebel Who Ruled the Golden Triangle. This book is based on a real person, Olive Young, and her life, and the great influence that she had in the area now often called the Northern Shan States, but particularly the Kokang region. And we are going to discuss all about this book and Olive today. Hello, Gabby, and congratulations on the publication.
Thank you. Hi, Luke.
All right, let's get straight into it. Olive Young, the rebellious Opium Queen, is a fascinating character, an inspiring one in some ways. So how did you come to write a book about this person? And who was she? You summarize it in the book with a question. You say, man, woman, myth, or legend?
So Olive was born the second daughter to a family of nobility in Northern Shan State in Kokang in the 1920s. And because of Olive's apparent gender and birth order, Olive's name at birth, the given name within the family, was Ergia. And because of World War II and because of how the conflict impacted the position of the border or the drawing of the border, Olive's family's land became disputed. So the family's position of power was in flux as Olive was coming into adulthood. And similarly, Olive's relationships with the brothers in the family whose power was coming into question because of the political situation, those relationships were in flux at the time as well. So the book explores how the family's fate is impacted by the fate of this border or the fate of the conflict within Burma. So I'd heard about Olive and had tried to find a way to confirm whether or not the many conflicting stories about Olive were true, because a lot of, when you hear about Olive, you hear things that cannot possibly both be true. For example, some people said that Olive was bisexual and some people said that Olive was gay, and, there are all sorts of conflicting stories about Olive that cannot possibly all be true in the identity of one person. So my interest was to find a way to fact check all of these mysteries or these myths about Olive. It seemed that nobody had ever, or that no journalist had ever made a genuine attempt to try to fact check these things. So it seemed like a worthy task.
And this person who came to occupy so much of your interest and so much of your time for so long, how did you even first encounter Olive Young? How did you find out about her? What were you doing, and what were you reading, or who were you talking to?
I think it was, so in 2015, the Kokang conflict came to a head again, and there was discussion about the ceasefire. And it was, it was difficult to find documentation of the original ceasefire. And then what was even more difficult to find was any documentation of discussions. And other journalists had suggested to me that, someone named Miss Hairy Legs would know. And what captured my attention about Olive was that element that there was a person who had been able to be so infamous yet so mysterious at the same time. So someone who could be well known yet unknown. That was what was interesting to me.
Okay, and before we get into the details about Olive, what was the writing process like? Was it easy? Was it difficult? How did you do it?
From the process perspective, what was most difficult, the page that was most difficult to write was the table of contents. So what was most difficult was trying to figure out a way to present the information to the reader that would make it clear that there were myths, and then there was an effort to try to back up those myths, or in some way bust those myths, either prove them true or wrong in some sort of documented manner. So what interested me about Olive's story was the way the myths about Olive impacted Olive's life and impacted Olive's actual story. So the myths about Olive, and also some of the things that Olive actually did, impacted Olive's family members, and then the way they spoke about Olive later in life. So what was important to the structure of the book was being able to present that information in a clear chronological manner, even though nothing in the book happened in a chronological manner, even though, there were interviews with people that happened, in 2015 or whatever, in the middle of parts of the book that were taking place in the 1950s. So the way I wrote the book was I tried to first lay down what I thought was more or less Olive's general life story, and then to find ways to intersperse conversations that I had with Olive's family members, so that the conversations I had with Olive's family members matched what was happening in Olive's story. So that was kind of the trickiest part of the book, was figuring out how to present that information to the reader. And then, so the experiences I had with Olive's family members also impacted me. The way that I was able to form a relationship with Olive's brother, Francis, that impacted how I felt about the story, and also how I felt, about my relationships with the people in the family. I think one of the most tragic characters in the book is Olive's son, Jeep. And in order to understand, exactly what kind of legacy Olive has left behind, I think Jeep kind of encapsulates that the most, because Jeep is, in some ways, the result of everything, bad that Olive did. Anyway, so over time, the way my feelings about Jeep also changed how I felt about the book, and changed how I felt about Olive as a character.
Yeah, your protagonist sort of dances through the pages of this book. They're always at the center of rumor and conjecture, and you get so many ambivalent sort of evaluations from all these different surviving relatives and contacts. And one device that you use in the book to sort of shed light on Olive's life is by introducing the many different names that she was known by. That might be a good way for us to continue. The first one that you use is Urjia. So who gave her that name, and what does that mean? What was Urjia doing when she became known as Urjia?
So Urjia was born the second daughter to, this family of 11 children, and Urjia just means, second sister. So the name denotes gender and birth order, and Urjia was known by this name until roughly age 10 or so, when the name Olive was given by, Catholic nuns at the Guardian Angel Convent in Mousse. So the actual, Olive's actual given name at birth, Yang Jinshu, is all of the Yang siblings have names that are derived from a generational poem. So all of the male relatives of Olive's generation have the same characters in there as a middle name, or as well. Anyway, so so Olive's brothers, Yang Chen Sein and Yang Chen Sai, they're also, named according to this generational poem. And it's mentioned in the book that the Yang family will meet its demise after the 8th generation. And, this curse came true eventually. The Yang family lost control of their land after the 8th generation. And then after, among the 9th generation, the following generation, there were no male relatives to pass on the name. So the generational poem that is, the poem from which all of the Yang siblings derive their names, there will not be any, future male Yang descendants to bear the names that would have come from this poem.
Yeah, that pervades that mood of the curse, pervades the whole story. And yeah, so Erjie, okay, a term of endearment, a Chinese term because of her position in the family when she was young, and then came the name Olive, which was directly inspired by the story of a Sicilian who was banished to Tunisia, a saint. So how on earth did that come to be, going from Erjie to this very exotic name?
So students at the Guardian Angel Convent were named after saints. So they were given English names and they were named after saints. Olive's namesake at this, and they were Italian nuns, right? So they were of the Pontifical Institute of Milan. So Olivia de Palermo is not an official saint, but was sanctified by sort of popular opinion. And there's no other saint named Olive. Like, Olive could not have been named after any other saint. So one can conclude that this is the saint after whom Olive was named.
Okay, but I mean, so how does a famous, wealthy, landowning family in the Kokang region send their kids to an Italian convent?
Right. So the Guardian Angel School in Lashio at the time it was an English language school, but the nuns who ran the school were trained through the Pontifical Institute in Milan. And at the time, Shan nobility would send their eldest sons and daughters to schools that had been established mostly by missionaries that were slightly better than the schools that they might have locally. So it was not, so when Olive was sent to school in Lashio, Olive joined the princesses of other ruling families at the school, or it was essentially an elite boarding school for Shan nobility, or for women. And then Olive's brothers went to another school, the Shan Chiefs School, which was a school modeled on Eton that had been established specifically to educate future rulers of the Shan state in a way that would make it easier for the British Crown to use them as administrators.
Okay, and so then in her adolescence, she gets this new Western name, Olive, and then she becomes an adult, and we discover a new name, which is Uncle Olive. What is the story behind this name, this honorific of Uncle Olive?
So it's unclear exactly when Olive started insisting on being called Uncle, but it must have happened at a relatively young age. It's likely or possible that Olive started going by Uncle, as early as the sort of early 1950s, around the time that Olive started working the caravan routes between Mandalay and the border.
Okay, so when she started her sort of professional career is likely when she started, and we can get into the gender stuff later, but we've got one more name here, which is also related, and this is the strangest name of them all. I'm not sure if it's derogatory. Maybe you can explain that. The name is Miss Hairy Legs. That is very striking. Where did that come from?
So Miss Hairy Legs is a translation from a Shan language nickname. And one of the interesting things about this nickname is that within the Yang family, there were no people who knew Olive by this name. So not in the Shan language or the English language. So they were really sort of surprised or insulted even to learn that this was a name that people associated with Olive, and were especially upset by the fact that it was false in some way, because Olive was not a particularly hairy person. So this sobriquet originated apparently among the Shan speaking resistance later in life, when Olive was known as a clandestine arms trader.
Okay, and when Uncle Olive was getting this nickname when she was working, when she was doing her endeavors at we could say the maybe the peak of her career. What was she actually doing in practical terms? What could you verify about her activities in this remote region that was beset by, real serious Cold War political intrigue? What did Olive actually do that you're certain of?
So the only business records I could find that were associated with Olive's name was a trucking company, the Yangzhenshu Trucking Company, whose services were listed in a Taiwanese business directory. So the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist government, had business networks that it set up in border areas where they could use local people who had some sort of power. So, for example, the Yang family, and support them through these business networks, and in exchange, create a barrier of resistance against the expansion of communist China. So when Olive established the trucking company that was listed through these Taiwanese business networks, it's likely that the business activity that was occurring was business activity that was in support of these anti-communist Taiwanese businessmen. So, okay, so when I was researching this book, my research process was to assume that everything that I encountered could in some way be wrong. For example, when I encountered mentions of Olive in communist memoirs, and they mentioned Olive engaging in espionage activity, I considered the possibility that Olive could have been engaging as a double agent, or that it could somehow be interpreted in a different way. So I tried not to jump to conclusions, and I tried to present the sources in a manner that the reader could then be allowed to draw their own conclusions about what would or would not be true. But broadly, it seems that Olive was engaging in a number of exploitative businesses, and that the exploitative businesses were exploiting both resources and labor. And it appears that, for example, in some of the local Gazette records, there are complaints about Olive engaging in a ranching business and not treating the cattle well, that sort of thing. So if there's a record that says Olive, engaged slave labor and then didn't treat the cattle well, and then you read about Olive in memoirs where, people refer to Olive as a slave driver, when you have those pieces of evidence together, you can conclude that it's probably true that Olive was engaging in exploitative businesses. But when you talk to Olive's relatives, they say that's not true. So without having confirmed with Olive, I think my writer's intuition is that probably some of the bad things that people say about Olive are probably true.
Yes, and you mentioned not being able to confirm with Olive. However, that was not for lack of trying. The events that you write about, they mostly happened decades ago, and you did meet many elderly relatives of Olive, some of whom you've mentioned, but you actually did meet Olive herself too. Could you tell us the story of that meeting?
It was a bizarre meeting because it was sort of mistakenly set up by Judy, Olive's sister. Rest in peace. And one day I was sitting in Judy's apartment, and I kept asking Judy questions about Olive, and Judy was getting sick of answering these questions. So one day Judy just called Olive and said, "There's someone here who wants to meet you." And by that point, I had actually already tried to go meet Olive and been rebuffed by Olive's stepson. So I thought it was probably my only chance to go meet Olive would be to have this invitation or this meeting arranged by her sister. But I had asked repeatedly, who the stepson was exactly, and I was never given a clear answer. And it wasn't until I realized, or it wasn't until I was already inside the militia headquarters where the stepson lived that I realized I had accepted an invitation, to go to a militia headquarters. So I had been informed that Olive's stepson was engaging in, a cattle import-export business. So essentially a business really similar to the business that Olive had been doing previously, a ranching business. And once I arrived there, there were armed guards. I essentially, I accepted an invitation, not realizing what the invitation was. And they invited me, not realizing that I was a journalist. They invited me thinking I was a distant relative because the meeting had been set up by Judy. So it was a strange meeting, and for that reason was cut short. But what was interesting about the experience was to see how, the family reacted to the breach of their compound. So once it was clear that I was not who they expected, and once it was clear that I'd brought recording equipment with me, so I think they assumed that I was CIA or something like that. And when I introduced myself as a reporter who had worked for the Voice of America, that didn't do much to change their suspicion. So when Olive's stepson Duan showed up and took the gun out of his pocket, I realized I'd sort of gotten myself into a strange situation. And at that stage, they must have had some sort of contingency plan or something like that in place, because suddenly, the entire family, all the women in the family, ran into the house and got dressed and escaped the compound. And then a little while later, a number of armed guards entered the compound. I didn't feel like I presented any sort of threat or need to escape the compound, but clearly I did. And clearly they felt that just having me there, or if perhaps a local police officer or something someone like that were aware that somebody entered the compound who didn't necessarily have a travel permit or something like that, that they might be able to get in trouble. So I think, so what was interesting for me about that meeting was seeing how they reacted to my presence in the compound. When I finally encountered Olive, I was a little shocked to see how frail Olive looked when we finally met. And Olive had a severe hip injury a few years prior to our meeting and had suffered a debilitating stroke just a few months prior. Olive was virtually unable to speak by the time I got there and was in diapers. And Judy had suggested that I bring diapers and cigarettes as a gift. And I felt really strange. It almost felt a little insulting to bring diapers, but it was the right choice. I felt lucky to be able to encounter Olive at all, but felt that, ultimately I had sort of failed at the meeting because it was too brief for me to really ask any significant questions or speak any words of consequence.
It would have been an amazing tightrope for you to walk if you had managed to endear yourself to that crowd, I think.
Well, I wonder now, I do wonder now if I had perhaps instead engaged in a written correspondence, if that wouldn't have been more effective, or asked a messenger to engage in a written correspondence with Olive, because Olive's nurse later in life would sort of sit by Olive's bed and read letters. So Olive did have correspondences, for any other researchers or journalists out there who are considering any sort of interview with a remote, elderly, mysterious person. I might suggest a written correspondence if you like not being threatened by guns.
That's sound advice, I think. So, yep, rest in peace, Olive Young. You chronicle some pretty awful things in the book that happened to her in her life, and you clearly identify with her. Now, maybe if not as a victim, maybe not as a hero, but maybe an anti-hero. She had to overcome some huge challenges. Some of them were chronic, running through her whole life, like the gender identity stuff, and some were acute, so there's reports that she was raped. But your book also recounts many, more stories from third parties about the crimes that she supposedly committed or delegated to her enforcers to commit. So after this process of writing this book, what do you think? Was Olive a hero? Was she an anti-hero? And how did she how do you think, given the context, even the context in which she died, we've just mentioned, how did she view violence, given this sort of blood-soaked world that she inhabited, at least for a time? It's a difficult question.
Right. So one of the stories about Olive that made me sort of made me spit my tea was the story that she almost stabbed a baby. Olive grew up surrounded by a very sort of eye for eye, tooth for tooth justice system, and was surrounded by muleteers who worked caravan routes that went through wild Wa territories where if you crossed the wrong person, you would end up beheaded. I think Olive's concept of violence was just a little bit different than mine. It makes me upset just to sort of be in the same room as a gun, but Olive apparently, never left the house without a gun. So Olive lived in a world where violence was expected and violence was part of the everyday experience for people. Olive grew up in Kokang, where for a time, any ethnically Kachin person could be killed just for entering the territory. And then for a time, members of the Yang family, had the right to sentence people to death. So if you committed a bad crime in Kokang, and if the ruler decided your crime was severe enough, they could decide to punish you by not just ending your life, but ending all your relatives. So banishing your relatives or ending the lives of your relatives. So I think Olive had a much higher threshold of tolerance for violence than I do, for example, or than I think the average person does.
Yes, and Olive's violence seems to be sort of correlated with her business success, or the success of her activities, which did come to an end. Olive did have a downfall of sorts. It was actually a betrayal by Lo Sing Han, who is an infamous tycoon, the person who founded the Asia World Company, and the father of Stephen Law, who remains a well-known crony capitalist in Myanmar today. So who was Lo Sing Han to Olive Young? And why and how did he betray her?
Yeah, so Lo Sing Han is, perhaps one of the most infamous drug lords of the Golden Triangle, and perhaps as a result of having been indicted in federal court in Brooklyn. And he was known as the godfather of opium, or the king of opium. And he got his start after being recruited into Edward's self-defense militia shortly after World War II, when waves of Chinese people who were escaping the communists were breaching Kokang's borders.
Just a quick interjection here, clarification. Edward is Olive's brother, and he was the ruler, the Sorpwa, of the Burmese state of Kokang when it was one of the Shan states.
So Lo Sing Han was the son to an administrator in Edward's government. So Lo Sing Han essentially started out as a Boy Scout, went to the Yang family's school. So the Yang family had established a military academy after World War II, and then was among the cadets who, defended the borders from those original raids after World War II. And the legend goes that Lo Sing Han was also among the original cadets who lit the diversionary fire along the Salween to keep Burmese troops at bay, while the KMT troops buried their weapons and hid and escaped. And there's numerous Chinese language legends and that kind of stuff about the border area. And some of them describe Lo Sing Han and Olive as lovers. Lo Sing Han was 10 years younger than Olive, and it's unlikely that they ever engaged in any sort of sexual relationship. probably unthinkable because I think Olive was just a little too gay to enjoy someone like Lo Sing-han in that manner. But Lo Sing-han ingratiated himself to Olive and was apparently very manipulative, and they had a really close relationship. So Olive treated him a little bit like an errand boy, and through this relationship with Olive was eventually able to gain more social capital within the family and eventually be trusted to, start his own business. So Lo Sing-han was Olive's right-hand man for a long time, and the Yang family's business was, essentially an import-export business, and they had import-export licenses for all sorts of goods, not just opium. So meat and textiles and that sort of thing. They were also the exclusive trading agents for the Burma Oil Company for a while, which is how they eventually managed to secure a trade monopoly on trucks, because they were the only people with petrol in the area. So if you needed gas, you were out of luck unless you bought it from a Yang family agent. So Lo Sing-han had a considerable amount of responsibility within the family business. And what people in the family believe is that when his opium caravan was seized in 1962, or rather, when his opium caravan was seized along with other Yang family opium caravans in 1963, he was taken prisoner and then offered a deal to betray the Yang family, undermine their power, and establish a militia under his command and under his power in the Kokang region that would be loyal to the local government. And this betrayal of the family, so the decision to establish his own personal center of power by having insinuated himself and then changing alliances, that's the betrayal that people in the family blame for Olive's downfall.
And then how did she end up in prison?
Olive was imprisoned by Ne Win months after the coup, nearly a year after the coup. And there's a lot of, so even within the Yang family, there's doubt and confusion about what exactly in the end led to the arrest or what it was about. So Judy, for example, is certain that the reason Olive was arrested is that Wawa Winshui wanted to cheat Olive out of the house, and that Wawa Winshui ratted.
Oop, just interjecting again here because we've got another character that the listener may not be familiar with. Wawa Winshui was a very famous actress in Myanmar, and at the beginning of her career, when she was a teenager, she became very close to Olive and lived in the same house as her for a few years. Olive transferred ownership of the house to her, and she actually still lives there and was there when Gabby met her in Rangoon.
And Judy's also convinced that Ne Win wanted Olive in jail so he could steal Olive's girlfriend. But what I think is likely is that the timing of the Yang family's downfall, I think, was simply more closely related to the timing of the opium harvest. So when Ne Win's coup happened, there was a process of slowly dismantling the economic networks that had been put in place by anti-communist Chinese that were supporting the anti-communist revolutionary activity. So precisely what Olive was doing, that trucking company, that import-export. And the process that happened following the coup of this sort of cleaning house of the economic structures that underpinned the anti-communist revolutionary activity, that had to happen step by step by eliminating business permit. So the Yang family was able to export opium because they had licenses, right, to export the opium. So following the coup, the next time there was a harvest and the next time there was a big export of opium, that's when they got arrested. So I think the timing of their arrest ultimately was more closely connected to eliminating the licenses and permits that underpinned their economic power.
And sort of zooming out again, going back to the book as a whole, your text is in conversation with quite a few other written works, as you mentioned. Most of them are in the Chinese language, but there are also some in English, not to mention all of the oral legends and things like that. And one in particular is by a person named Gerard Sparrow, and it's quite a salacious account. So maybe you could discuss his work and who he was and his connection to Olive, and why you chose to draw on that and write back at that in your book.
Yeah, so Gerald Sparrow was at one point admitted to work as a judge on an international court in Thailand. And he was a prisoner of war during World War II, and then eventually worked as a lawyer in Thailand and was sort of the original sexpat in a way. And he wrote a lot about his opinions on women and had a sort of Orientalist Goldilocksian approach. So in one of his books, he says that white women are too cold, Chinese women are too hot, and Thai women are just right. And he wrote a number of books about his experiences in Thailand and then also elsewhere, and then wrote books about law, and had a fascination with violent women, in particular with criminal women. So I would ask members of the Yang family if they'd seen any books written about Olive, and Judy kept mentioning this one book that was full of disgusting sexual lies about Olive. And it took me a little while to eventually find the book to which Judy was referring, but it was this book by Gerald Sparrow. Gerald Sparrow had created this sexual psychological profile for Olive that essentially could not possibly have been true, because Olive was gay. Olive was just, too gay for any of these things to have been true. And the story that Judy told was that Olive had at one point tried to extort this judge, and had apparently tried to convince the judge to marry her, but the judge had refused. And that detail is in the book, or in the novel that Gerald Sparrow wrote. But I don't think that the circumstances of the marriage proposal were the way they were written in the book. So Judy confirmed that at one point Olive had tried to extort a judge, but did not describe the supposed extortion attempt the way it was described by Gerald Sparrow in the book. And then the reason I found Gerald Sparrow as a character so interesting is that, in a sense, Gerald Sparrow had tried in some way to, write meaningfully about the secret business networks and the smuggling that was occurring in the border region as a result of the, anti-communist struggle. But in his attempt to do that, had created this fictionalized character in Olive.
Yeah, I mean, the quotes that you put in your book from that are quite outrageous, really. It's hard to imagine the same author writing serious treatises on the law.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things, Gerald Sparrow mentions in his book is that he becomes infatuated or obsessed with the idea of meeting, this opium princess across the border. And, immediately upon, while sitting on the bench in the court, immediately upon hearing about this sort of violent woman, starts to fantasize about her sexually. So when you imagine that a judge sitting on the bench is distracted by sexual fantasies of people who are mentioned in his court cases, it's a slightly upsetting thing to think about. But in some ways, you encounter men like Gerald Sparrow, or people like Gerald Sparrow, in Thailand today. The character of Gerald Sparrow, is all over the place today.
I don't know how long it took you to write this book, but I get the feeling it was a while, because you're doing interviews in very remote locations and internationally, and there's quite a few sources as well referenced in your portrait of Olive. So I think researching this book was no picnic. Do you have any advice, Gabby, for other people who want to tell stories from and about Myanmar?
I guess the best piece of advice would be spend lots of time in the National Archives and don't assume that something won't be available if you ask again. That was something that was mysterious to me. So using the National Archives in Yangon, that was like a mysterious experience for me. And then it's also really shocking how much archival material is available outside of Myanmar. So the New York Public Library, for example, has really great, weekly bulletins from the 1950s. There are a lot of archives all around the United States that have records from missionaries, and the ANU library in Canberra also had really good archival records in both English and Burmese and also in Chinese. And then one of the things that was really remarkable is how much was available on the digitized, declassified documents on the CIA website. And then once you make yourself familiar with what's already been digitized, going to the National Archives in DC, it's also really shocking what's available in terms of declassified records. So I was able to find the records of librarians who had distributed anti-communist pamphlets in the 1950s at the National Archives in DC. So I was able to find records of anti-communist activity in Olive's region from the comfort of a library in DC. You don't really have to go that far or risk that much to find something really good. It's actually a lot easier to just go to an archive.
The last question I always ask is for our guest to give a recommendation. So something to do with Myanmar. I guess it's an opportunity for you to cast your mind back to your time in the country, or you could think of another book that you like about Myanmar, just something to end the podcast with. Anything to recommend?
So the most enjoyable reading that I did for this book was, so the books I enjoyed the most while I was researching this book were books that were written in the 1950s and 60s. So Burma Drop and Alan Winnington, Slaves of the Cool Mountains. So I really recommend Alan Winnington's books. And in particular, I enjoyed Burma Drop because it was a really great snapshot of the collision of cultures when Americans first started to enter the region and the way the encounters between Americans and locals unfolded. So those are my recommendations: Burma Drop and Slaves of the Cool Mountains.
Hey, those are two titles that I'm totally unfamiliar with, so thank you. I look forward to acting on those recommendations. And thank you, Gabby, for coming on Myanmar Musings. I recommend your book to all our listeners.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you'll definitely, thank you so much.